podcast guesting can be one of the most effective ways to grow your podcast. That is, when you're on the right shows. But if you're not actively networking with other creators, you're probably wondering, how do I actually find good podcasts to guest on? In this episode, I'm going to walk you through 5 simple ways to find shows that are a good fit and, more importantly, will actually grow your audience. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Podcast Playbook. I'm Justin Peters, and alongside my brother, we run a podcast production company where we help coaches and advisors create and grow their podcast. I'm really excited about this episode because it's going to be very tactical, and I love tactical episodes. A question I get pretty often is, where do I find podcasts to guest on? And today, I'm going to be walking you through 5 different ways that I go about finding and sourcing opportunities. I'm going to do my best to give you at least a general step-by-step overview or instructions for each one. And I'm going to reference a couple of tools that are going to make it easier throughout. If you have a podcast team, a VA, an ops manager, someone that can help you with podcast guesting, this is going to be a great episode to save and send to them so they can help you start sourcing the right opportunities. And as always, if you got questions about this episode or you're looking for support with your own show, you can email me at justin@simplepodstudios.com. Okay, so before we get into the 5 methods, let's quickly talk about why podcast guesting actually works for growing your show. The biggest reason is pretty simple. You're operating in the same medium. When you guest on a podcast, you already know the audience listens to podcasts. That might sound obvious, but it's a huge advantage over some other strategies. Compare that to social media, where roughly 40% of the people don't listen to or watch podcasts. You're already fighting an uphill battle, losing almost half the audience there. And even beyond that, think about intent. When someone is scrolling social media, they're usually not looking for a new podcast to listen to right then. They're taking a break, they're killing some time, they're winding down in the evening. But when someone is listening to a podcast, they're in a completely different mindset. They might be driving, working out, making dinner. They're actively doing something more than likely. So when an episode ends and they're not done with what they're doing, they're naturally looking for the next thing to listen to. And if they just heard a great guest on a show they already trust, the easiest next step is to go check out that guest podcast. So if podcast guesting works, why hasn't it worked for you? Maybe you've tried it before, gone on a few shows here and there, but you didn't see much from it. In most cases, it's probably going to come down to 3 things. The first 2 we're going to fix in this episode. The third we're going to cover in a future one. The first is no targeting. You're saying yes to any show that will have you on regardless of the audience. But if the listeners aren't a fit for your podcast, they're not magically going to become your listeners. Second, the audience is too small. If you go on 10 podcasts with 50 listeners each, that's 500 total listeners. Even the best podcast guest could probably only convert 5 to 10% of those listeners, and adding 25 to 50 new listeners over the course of 10 published dates just probably won't be that noticeable. And third, you're not converting listeners well. You might show up, it could be a decent conversation, but if it's generic, it's forgettable, or there's no clear reason for someone to check out your podcast, or maybe they didn't even know you had a podcast because you didn't pitch your podcast, then you're not going to see results. We'll dive deeper into the conversion conversation in a future episode, and I'm going to share a few ways to estimate audience size later in this one. But for now, let's focus on the most important piece, finding the right shows. So now I'm going to walk you through the 5 methods that I've been teasing. All right, so method number 1 is recommended shows. Spotify and Apple both have recommended shows based on what your listeners are listening to. And this is a great place to source potential guest opportunities. So open up your Spotify app and go and search your show. Then on your show page, there is going to be a tab called More Like This. Click on that tab and you're going to see 20 recommendations. These recommendations are based on what your listeners are subscribed and listening to. So of course, you and that show have some kind of audience overlap. And that is a prime opportunity for you to go and guest on that show. And then you can do the exact same thing in Apple. So open up your Apple Podcast app and then search for your show. You're going to open up your show page and you're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of your show page. And you're going to see a section called You Might Also Like. In this section, Apple surfaces 15 recommendations. So between Spotify and Apple, you should have about 35 recommendations. There might be some overlap. I'm assuming there's probably going to be some overlap, but I still think you should walk away with 25 solid recommendations. I will point out that if you have a smaller show, you might not see 20 or 15 recommendations on Spotify and Apple. You might see a little bit less, Also, if you have a smaller show, those recommendations might not have the correlation that you're looking for. That's probably just because there's not enough listener data for Spotify or Apple to accurately showcase shows that are just like yours. But don't worry, you can do an alternative if you're in that situation. You don't have to always look at your own show. You can find one of your peers' shows and you can follow the exact same steps and you can find their recommended shows. And I honestly think that's probably a pretty good idea to do, even if you're a larger show that's showing the full 35 recommendations between Spotify and Apple. One thing that I like to do to beef up my list even more is to click on the shows that are recommended on my page, go to their page, and then look at their recommendations. So then you're going to get another 35 recommendations, maybe some similar to the recommendations already on your list. But if you do this for all of the shows that are recommended on your page, and then you look at the recommendations of those recommendations, you're going to walk away with a list of probably about 100 to 150 shows. The second method that I like to follow to find guesting opportunities is what I call guest stalking. So I want you to think about a peer, a competitor, somebody in your space. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone that does exactly what you do. If you're a financial advisor, you can think about a tax expert or a real estate broker or an insurance agent, somebody that you know has appeared on different shows, maybe does a fair amount of podcast guesting. Write down a couple of those people. Then I want you to go to a website called podchasers.com. That's podchasers.com. You're going to see a search bar there, and you're going to switch that search bar from all to podcast episodes, and then you are going to search by your peer's name. And then all of a sudden, Podchaser is going to give you a list of shows that that person has been on. This is a great way to figure out where some of your peers have been, what shows actually have guests, finding a good fit opportunity. It can also work out really well if you use their name in the cold pitch. Maybe instead of looking up a peer, you actually looked up a former guest of yours. Then you can send a pitch to the podcast host and say, hey, I saw that you had Kyle Peters on your show and you guys talked about podcast growth. Kyle was actually on my show. He did a great job. And I was actually wondering if you would want to cover that topic. I have a little bit different thought than Kyle, and I see that you haven't covered the topic in 6 months. This already establishes a connection with the host and allows you a warmer end than just a straight up cold pitch. If you look through 3 to 5 pretty active peers of yours, you should walk away with a list of probably 25 to 50 new podcasts that you can guest on. All right, the third method to find shows to guest on is a topic-based search. So I want you to think about a couple of niche keywords that relate to what you would want to talk about on a podcast. For example, if you're a leadership consultant, think managing a growing team. If you're a financial advisor, maybe it's when to claim Social Security. Or if you're a wellness coach, it could be weight loss tips on a busy schedule. Think about a couple of those topics that you would want to cover. And then I want you to go into Spotify, go into Apple, whichever you prefer. Honestly, Podchaser could be another alternative, but I typically just like to use Spotify or Apple for this, and search that phrase. And then all of a sudden, you're going to get a list of shows that have episodes about that topic and or their whole show is about that topic. And these are going to be really good opportunities or really good shows that you should potentially write down on your target list. I also like doing topic-based searches because it allows you to find some not so obvious adjacent podcast. If we go back to like the wellness coach, clearly the wellness coach wants to be on Health and Wellness podcast and they'd want to share their weight loss tips on those shows. But if they search weight loss tips on a busy schedule, they might also surface a parenting show and see that a parenting show covered this topic maybe a year ago. And this is a great opportunity for them to follow up with the host and let them know, hey, I see you covered this in the past. I'm curious how well it performed. And if you'd like to cover the topic again, I would love to come on and share some more tips for your audience. And then you might double down and look for more parenting shows and send a similar pitch to those parenting shows. So topic-based searches are great to find some shows that cover the different topics that you're planning to talk about. I think you can easily find probably 25 to 50 podcasts via this method. And if you run out of podcasts, then think about another one of your niche topics that you'd want to talk about and repeat this process again. Okay, so up until this point, we've talked about recommended shows, guest stalking, and topic-based searches. And I think between the three of those, you can really get a list of about 100 to 200 shows that you could potentially guest on. But I want to recommend 2 more slightly not so obvious ways. These aren't probably going to bring back the same volume as the first 3, but they could probably be even more impactful. And number 4 is to ask your clients. As you start podcast guesting, a great thing to consider is to reach out to your clients and just simply ask them, what shows do you listen to? Especially, what shows do you listen to learn about XYZ topic? Or what shows do you listen to that have helped you in your business or helped you with whatever you help them solve? And they're going to surface some ideas that you probably never even thought about. For example, one of my clients actually shared an episode of one of his favorite creators. They were talking about a podcast strategy that he wanted to implement. He shared the episode with me, and you better believe that now that show is on my target list to go and guest on. If my client likes it and my client is an ideal fit for me, I know there should be more ideal fit clients that are listening to the podcast that he recommended. This might not get you a ton of shows. Some of your clients might respond back, but they don't listen to podcasts, or it could be more aspirational shows like Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss that you might not necessarily have an opportunity to guest on. But I do think you're going to find a couple of really good opportunities by following this exercise. I'd hope to find probably 5, 10, 20 quality opportunities by asking my clients. Okay, the 5th and final method that I want to share now is to mine your own network. There are tons of people that you already know who have a podcast and have a podcast and cover a topic on their podcast that you would be a really good fit as a guest for. And my favorite way to do this is to go to LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, you can go up to the search bar and you can type in podcast or podcaster. If you press enter and then filter by your first degree connections, you're going to get a list of people who use the word podcast or podcaster in their profile. Now you can go through that list and see who had a podcast. I do this on occasion, and I'm always blown away with how many people have a podcast that I didn't even know had a podcast. And of course, if your LinkedIn is full of people that you know, these are already warm introductions. And I think this is great, especially when you first start podcast guesting. Go to the people that you already know for podcast guesting opportunities. I actually just went ahead and did this in my LinkedIn. My LinkedIn's probably a little bit different because I have a lot of podcasters that I follow or follow me, but I had 12 pages of people who have podcast or podcaster in their profile. That's 120 people to go through and see if I'd be a good fit for their show. You might not have that many, but I wouldn't be surprised if you found 20 or 25 people on your LinkedIn connections that have a podcast, and probably half of them you might be a potentially good fit for. One more bonus tip on this is to mine your former guest. A lot of the guests that you have on your show are probably also creating content themselves, and they have their own owned channels. So seeing if any of your guests have podcasts and reaching out to your former guest and asking if you can be on their show is another great way, in a warm way, to potentially get some more opportunities to podcast guest. All right, so as a recap, here are the 5 ways again. Number 1, go through the recommended shows on Apple and Spotify. This has got to easily net you 100 plus shows. If you're one of the smaller creators, go and look at a peers show page and do the exact same process. Number 2 is guest stalking. Follow 3 to 5 of your peers, your competitors, people who are doing podcast appearances. You should easily net 25 to 50 opportunities this way. Third is to do a topic-based search. Pick 2 or 3 topics that you would really love to talk about. Search those in Spotify and Apple and see what podcasts are covering those topics or have covered those topics in the past. Number 4 is to ask your clients. You'll be surprised how many of them give you recommendations on shows they really love that they think that you should be on. And number 5 is to mine your own network. I love using LinkedIn. You could look at your phone contacts. You could look at your email contacts. You could look at the list of your former guest. There are tons of opportunities you can find in your immediate network. All right, so by this point, you might have a list of 100, maybe even 200 plus podcasts that you could guest on. But now the real question is, how do I quickly tell which ones are actually a good fit? You don't need to go on every podcast. You don't need to turn podcast guesting into a part-time job. You want it to support your podcast growth strategy. So let's start with a couple of simple filters to narrow things down fast. The first thing that I'd look at is, are they still releasing episodes? You'd be surprised how many podcasts are inactive. If they haven't published an episode recently, maybe in the last month or 2, it's probably not worth your time reaching out and pitching yourself. And then second, do they actually have guests on? Some shows are solo only, others rarely bring people on. If they're not regularly featuring guests and you don't know the host personally, it's going to be an uphill battle to get booked. So those are probably the 2 obvious filters to put your shows through, but I want you to consider a few other items as well. First is the audience size. As I mentioned, some shows, depending on the person, might not be worth going on. If 50 listeners that might convert 5 to 10 listeners doesn't feel like an impactful use of 1 hour of your time, then it just might not be worth going on some smaller shows. For other people, getting a new 5 to 10 listeners might be a great accomplishment, and it's totally worth an hour of their time. I think this is all going to be dependent on each individual creator, your time, your budget, the size of your show currently. There are a couple of factors to consider here. But how do you gauge the size of the podcast? The honest answer is it's a bit of an estimate. Unlike social media or YouTube views, podcast downloads aren't public, so you're not going to get perfect data, but you can get some directional confidence. First, I think one of the easiest things to do is just look at the number of reviews on Apple and Spotify. Reviews aren't perfect, but there's usually a loose correlation between reviews and audience size. And then second, you can use a tool called ListenNotes. It's probably one of my favorite tools out there for this in particular. So if you go to listennotes.com, search the podcast name, it's got to give you what they call a global rank. And for global rank, the smaller the percentage, the bigger the show. I haven't been able to find anything published from ListenNotes on how the global rank is exactly calculated, but here's a rough guide based on looking at our clients' shows over the last couple of years. Shows in the top 10% are typically pretty small. These are going to be shows with 50 downloads or less. I honestly haven't seen anything larger than 10%. Most shows are inactive, and I think a database is all the active shows that are out there. You can assume the top 10% of shows on ListenNotes are the smaller shows. As you get into the top 5% and below, you're going to start to see some more traction. A lot of those shows are going to be in the 50 to 500 download range. And then once you're under 2%, the shows usually start to have a meaningful audience. I would say most of the 2% and below shows, 2, 1.5%, 1%, a half percentage, these are going to be shows that have 1,000 plus downloads per episode. Again, this is not exact, but I think it's enough to help you prioritize what opportunities might be worth your time. So besides the show size, what else should you consider in your search process? Here are a couple things to look for pretty quickly. First, does the show feel professional? That doesn't mean it needs to be perfect, but look at the cover art, the episode titles, the overall presentation. If it feels thrown together, there's probably a pretty good chance the audience and the reach aren't very strong either. Second, are they focused or all over the place? If the premise of the podcast and the episode topics are broad, generic, constantly changing, it's usually a sign that the audience isn't clearly defined. And if an audience isn't clearly defined, like we've talked about many times on this show, it's going to be much harder for your parents to translate into listeners. And then third, are they consistent? If they're publishing sporadically, it likely means their audience isn't consistently tuning in either. And it's gonna make it tough to get any real traction from your episode. And actually, one final point on this too, does it feel like a natural fit or are you forcing it? If you have to over-explain why you're relevant to their audience, you're probably not. And that's probably a sign for you to just move on. As we mentioned at the top of this episode, if their listeners aren't your ideal listeners, then you're not going to convert their listeners magically into your listeners. I think that's my list as you just get started in podcast guesting, but I think you'll refine this over time. You're going to start to notice which types of shows lead to great conversations, and you'll figure out which ones are going to feel like a grind or aren't going to go anywhere. So early on, you might be a little less selective, and I think that's totally okay. But if you want podcast guesting to become a sustainable way for you to grow your show, you're going to want to identify the opportunities that actually move the needle and avoid the ones that don't or just got to drain you. There are some podcast hosts out there, they don't give any communication up front, they ask generic questions, they change the scheduling around all of the time. There are things that I've found through podcast guesting that I'm like, you know what, if I spot one of these red flags early on, then I'm just going to pass on the opportunity to guest on the show. All right, so at this point, you should have everything you need to build a strong list of podcasts to guest on through either one or all the methods that we discussed today. These include recommended shows, guest stalking, topic-based searches, asking your clients, and mining your own network. But we both know that finding the right shows is only part of the equation. So in a future episode, we're going to break down how to actually get booked and how to show up as a guest in a way that turns their listeners into your listeners. So if you don't want to miss those, make sure that you're following the show on your favorite podcast app. That's it for today. I'm Justin, and thanks for tuning into Podcast Playbook.